The air in the Albright parlor was thick with the cloying sweetness of lilies and the underlying, metallic tang of the mortician's preservatives. Silas, his hands sheathed in black velvet to prevent smudges, adjusted the head of the late Mrs. Albright upon the velvet chaise. She was propped up beside her husband, his waxen face fixed in a semblance of paternal calm, a book held open in his stiffened fingers. Before them, their 2 children were arranged like beloved, broken dolls, the son standing with a hand on his father's shoulder, the daughter seated at her mother's feet, a porcelain doll in her own limp grasp. It was a common enough request for a post-mortem artist, this preservation of a final family tableau. But the Albright Commission was different. They were all here. The entire family, extinguished within a week by a swift and brutal fever, also the reclusive uncle, Mr. Thorne, had claimed. He had paid Silas a king's ransom not for individual portraits of grief, but for a single, grand composition, a memory of a happy family, frozen in a moment of domestic bliss that had never truly existed. Silas stepped back to the heavy, tripod-mounted camera, its single glass eye a cyclopean orb staring into the staged scene. The room was a tomb draped in velvet, the only light the grey London afternoon bleeding through the draped windows, augmented by the magnesium flash powder he would soon ignite. He had dressed them himself, in their own fine clothes provided by Thorne. The rustle of silk and starched linen was a dry, dead sound. As he prepared the silver-coated plate, his eyes were drawn to the youngest, the girl. Her name was Clara. In life, she must have been a vibrant thing. In death, her skin was the color of old milk. But it was her wrists, peeking from the lace cuffs, that held his gaze. Faint, like shadows under the skin, were the telltale bruises of restraint. Not the marks of a sickbed, but of struggle. A coldness that had nothing to do with the room seeped into Silas's bones. He looked from the daughter to the son, to the parents. Their poses were too perfect, too artfully arranged. The uncle's instructions had been unnervingly specific. They must look as if they are merely waiting. As if they might, at any moment, draw breath. He slid the plate holder into the camera, his movements slow, deliberate. The silence was a physical presence, a weight pressing down on the opulent furniture and the still forms. For a fleeting, horrifying instant, he thought he saw the son's chest shudder with a phantom breath. He blinked, and the illusion was gone. It was the poor light, the strain on his nerves. It had to be. He took the pneumatic bulb in his hand, the rubber cold and pliant. He was no longer just a photographer capturing a memento mori. He was an archaeologist of a crime the commission arrived not through the usual channels of a grieving widow or a somber father, but as a sealed letter delivered by a man whose demeanor was as grey and unyielding as the granite of a new-made headstone. The request within was written in a sharp, precise hand, the ink a stark black that seemed to swallow the light from the paper. It was from a Mr. Alistair Thorne, the sole surviving relative of the recently departed Albright family. The fee offered was obscenely generous, a sum that could silence the whispers of conscience for a lifetime, but it was the specifics of the request that caused a cold knot to tighten in Silas's stomach. He was not being asked to photograph a single, peaceful soul laid out in their final rest, a common enough practice to provide a keepsake for those left behind. This was different. Mr. Thorne required a single, grand composition, a portrait of the entire family. The mother, the father, the teenage son, and the young daughter, all taken by the same swift and brutal fever within days of one another, were to be photographed together. They were to be arranged not in the cold quiet of a mortuary, but within their own parlor, seated amongst their own furniture and possessions, posed in a tableau of domestic life. The instruction was to use their own fine clothes, to position them as if they were merely gathered for an evening by the fire, caught in a moment of quiet conversation that had been tragically interrupted. The concept of photographing multiple deceased was not entirely unheard of, but it was a macabre and logistically nightmarish endeavor, reserved for the most extreme and unsettling of circumstances. It required an artist of particular skill and particular moral flexibility, and Silas knew his reputation had preceded him. This was more than a memento mori, it was a perverse recreation of life, a denial of the finality of death itself. The sheer scale of it, the theatricality, suggested a client whose motives were layered in shadows far deeper than simple grief. As Silas read the letter again, the words seemed to shift, the politeness of the phrasing barely containing a frantic, obsessive energy beneath. He was not being hired to document a death, but to construct a lie, to build a stage upon which the dead would be forced to perform one last time for an audience of one. The weight of the task settled upon him, a physical pressure. He would have to manage the logistics of transporting and supporting multiple bodies, of disguising the grim realities of rigor mortis and pallor, of creating a seamless illusion that would forever hang upon a wall, a silent, screaming testament to something he did not yet understand. The client, Mr. Thorne, arrived at Silas's studio not as a grieving relative shrouded in black, but as a fastidious curator overseeing a macabre exhibition. His grief, if it existed at all, was buried beneath an unnerving, precise enthusiasm for the project's details. He did not bring the bodies of the Albright family shrouded in simple linen for their final journey. Instead, he brought a collection of their own personal effects, laid out with a disturbing intimacy. There was the father's favorite smoking jacket, the mother's gown of deep emerald silk, the son's stiff new suit, and the daughter's white lace dress, each item smelling faintly of cedar and lavender from their wardrobes, a ghost of the lives they had once inhabited. Thorne insisted, with a quiet but unyielding authority, that they must be dressed in these specific garments, that the authenticity of their own wardrobe was paramount to the verisimilitude he demanded. His instructions then moved to the poses, which he described with a director's fervor. The father was to be standing, one hand resting lightly on the globe beside his desk, as if pondering a journey he would never take. The mother was to be seated at the pianoforte, her fingers arranged not on the keys, but resting just above them, capturing a moment of anticipated music. The son was to be looking slightly upward, a thoughtful, almost hopeful expression engineered upon his face, while the daughter was to be caught in a moment of playful repose, a small, porcelain doll clutched in her hand. These were not the passive, sleeping postures of the peacefully departed common to the post-mortem art. They were dynamic, lifelike positions, requiring complex armatures and clever propping to achieve. Thorne's demand was for an impossible vitality, a suspension of decay that defied the very nature of his subjects. He spoke of capturing the essence of their spirit, of freezing a moment of perfect familial harmony, but his eyes, cold and assessing, held the gleam of a man assembling a trophy. This was not a memorial born of love, but a reconstruction born of obsession, a forced performance where the dead were compelled to act out a scene of domestic bliss under the unblinking eye of the camera, a pantomime of life orchestrated for a purpose that sent a silent, chilling warning through Silas's veins. The specific, lively poses were not a tribute, they were a command, and the dead, it seemed, had no choice but to obey the whims of the living who held their strings. The preparation was a meticulous and grim ballet, each step requiring a somber reverence that Silas had long ago hardened into routine. He began with the daughter, little Clara, as she seemed the most fragile, her small form almost lost within the lavish folds of the white lace dress Mr. Thorne had provided. The room was cold, the air thick with the cloying scent of the lilies he had placed around the parlor to mask the inevitable, slowly advancing odor of mortality. As he worked to position her delicate limbs, arranging her hands to clasp the porcelain doll with a convincing naturalness, his focus was absolute, his touch practiced and gentle. It was when he went to adjust the lace cuff on her right sleeve, which had rucked up slightly during her transportation, that his professional detachment fractured. The fabric resisted his touch, and as he carefully worked it back down her pale forearm, the grayish light from the window fell upon her wrist. There, circling the bone like a vile bracelet, was a faint but unmistakable bruise. It was not the singular, blotchy mark of a feverish fall or the careless grip of a frantic parent. This was a pattern of 4 distinct, oval discolorations, with a 5th, broader mark pressed against the opposite side of her thin wrist. It was the clear, damning imprint of a large, adult hand. A hand that had gripped her with significant, brutal force. The blood seemed to drain from his own face, pooling coldly in his feet. He stood frozen, staring at the evidence of a struggle that had no place in the narrative of a swift and peaceful fever. His eyes, against his will, darted to the faces of the other family members, posed in their serene tableau. Was the father's paternal calm merely the mask of death, or was it a lie constructed over something more violent? Was the mother's graceful posture at the pianoforte a final, elegant deception? The carefully constructed scene of domestic tragedy began to curdle, revealing a darker, more sinister truth festering just beneath the surface. The air in the room, once merely cold, now felt actively hostile, and the silence was no longer one of peace, but of a secret violently kept. The darkroom was his sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world was distilled into the stark, beautiful order of silver and shadow. Here, in the blood-red glow of the safe light, the unsettling atmosphere of the Albright parlor could be dismissed as a trick of the nerves. He worked with the methodical precision of a surgeon, mixing the pungent chemicals, his movements calm and assured as he slid the exposed glass plate from its holder into the first bath. The developer was an alchemist's potion, a liquid secret that held the truth of the image captive. He began to agitate the tray, a gentle, rocking motion, his eyes fixed on the blank, ghostly surface of the plate. Slowly, as if emerging from a deep fog, the shapes began to form. The outline of the heavy drapes first, then the stern face of the father by the globe, the seated form of the mother at the pianoforte. The figures of the children solidified, their posed stillness captured for eternity. It was a technically perfect exposure, the composition exactly as he had framed it. But as the solution continued its work, deepening the blacks and brightening the whites, a detail that should not have been there began to resolve in the background, just over the mother's left shoulder. At first, it was a mere smudge, a flaw in the emulsion he attributed to a dust speck on the plate. Yet, as the image clarified, the smudge elongated, taking on a definite, unnerving shape. It was a tall, thin, humanoid form, a column of darkness that stood amongst the family. It lacked precise features, its face a blur of indistinct shadows, but its posture was unmistakably that of an observer, a silent, fifth member of the group that had been utterly invisible to his own eye as he stood behind the camera. A cold dread, far colder than the chemical baths, washed over him. He had been alone in that room with the 4 bodies. The doors had been locked. The lighting had been controlled, leaving no hidden corner from which a man could watch unseen. This was no double exposure, no simple flaw, the chemistry did not lie. Something had been present, a presence that had imprinted itself upon the light-sensitive silver nitrate, a spectral intruder captured not by his art, but by some deeper, more terrible magic. The family was not alone in their memorial. They were being watched, and now, that watcher was here in the developing tray with him, its dark form bleeding into reality from a world that should have remained forever separate. The session was a protracted exercise in morbid theater, demanding a level of artifice that pushed the very limits of his skill. Each body required a complex, hidden armature of wires and stands to maintain the illusion of life, their stiffening limbs resisting the poses Mr. Thorne had so obsessively dictated. Silas moved between them, a stage manager for the dead, adjusting a slackened jaw here, repositioning a heavy hand there, his own breathing the only sound in the thick silence. He had just finished securing the son, Edmund, for the 3rd time, as the boy's head had a persistent tendency to loll forward, ruining the effect of hopeful contemplation. Stepping back to assess the composition from the camera's perspective, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision snagged his attention. It came from Edmund. He stood frozen, his own breath held, watching the teenage boy's face. For a heart-stopping second, he was certain he saw the boy's left eyelid, which he had painstakingly sealed shut with a touch of wax, twitch. It was a subtle, tremulous spasm, a mere shadow of movement, but in the absolute stillness of the parlor, it was as shocking as a gunshot. He dismissed it instantly as a trick of the low, shifting light from the window, a phantom born from his own straining eyes and the oppressive atmosphere. He proceeded, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the magnesium flash. The first explosive burst of light illuminated the scene in a stark, frozen instant. After the spots cleared from his vision, he moved to change the plate for a second exposure, a safety measure against any flaw in the first. As he passed the family, his gaze was once again, irresistibly, drawn to Edmund. The boy's position had changed. It was infinitesimal, a matter of millimeters, but undeniable. The hand that had been resting lightly on the back of his father's chair now displayed a subtle, claw-like tension in the fingers, as if in a final, desperate spasm of protest. The carefully arranged expression of thoughtful hope had shifted, the line of the mouth now set in a grimace of trapped agony. The air fled his lungs. A trick of the light could not explain this. It was a physical alteration, a defiance of the rigid finality that had, until this moment, held the boy captive. The body was not merely decaying, It was reacting. Some last, deep-seated spark of the nervous system, some final, trapped impulse of the soul was fighting its way to the surface, a silent scream manifesting in the slow, terrible grammar of the dead. The parlor, after the final photograph was taken, felt like a violated tomb. The lingering, acrid scent of the flash powder hung in the air, a chemical ghost overlying the sweet decay. Silas worked quickly now, his earlier dread solidified into an urgent need to be free of this house and its secrets. His task was to dismantle his own grim handiwork, to disassemble the posed figures and prepare them for the silent, waiting coffins. As he carefully lifted the mother, Eleanor Albright, from her seat at the pianoforte, her body was unnaturally rigid, resisting his efforts. The complex armature of wires and supports he had fashioned had become tangled in the elaborate folds of her emerald silk gown. As he worked to free the stiffened form, his fingers, seeking a purchase, brushed against a small, hard object secreted within a hidden pocket sewn into the skirt. Retrieving it, he found a small, leather-bound diary, its cover soft and worn from use. The practicality of his work took over. He slipped the book into his own waistcoat pocket to return to Mr. Thorne later, a final piece of the woman to be buried with her. It was only later, in the relative safety of his carriage as it rattled away from the Albright house, that he remembered it. The city lights flickered through the window as he opened the small volume. The entries began with the mundane poetry of a life, notes on garden parties, her children's accomplishments, a new piece of sheet music. But the tone shifted dramatically in the final weeks. The handwriting, once flowing and elegant, became a frantic, jagged scrawl. She wrote of a creeping malaise that seemed to target only their household, of strange, bitter tastes in their evening tea, of waking in the night with a paralyzing weakness. Her suspicions, once vague unease, crystallized with terrifying clarity onto a single name, her brother-in-law, Alistair Thorne. She documented his increased, uninvited presence in their home, his obsessive interest in their financial affairs, his strange, avuncular affection that now felt like the circling of a vulture. The final entry, dated the day before she fell gravely ill, was a single, desperate sentence, the ink blotted as if by a trembling hand. He speaks of legacy and remembrance, but his eyes are full of a terrible, hungry silence. I fear he is not waiting for us to die, but is actively, patiently, building our tomb around us while we still breathe. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The bruises on the girl's wrist, the demand for the specific, lively portrait, the entire macabre commission. It was not the product of grief, but the final, triumphant act of the murderer himself, a man not content with merely taking their lives, but intent on stealing and reshaping their very memory, turning them into permanent, placid actors in the narrative of his own crime. The agreed-upon date for the collection of the final photograph was still 2 days hence, which made the sharp, imperious rap at his studio door that very evening all the more jarring. Silas had been staring at the developed print, now sealed behind glass in a frame of polished ebony, the spectral fifth figure a constant, chilling presence in his peripheral vision. Opening the door, he found Mr. Thorne standing in the fog-wreathed street, his tall form casting a long, distorted shadow into the studio's interior. He did not wait for an invitation, stepping inside with an air of ownership that dismissed the formality of the threshold. His eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the room before locking onto the framed photograph resting on the velvet-draped table. He moved towards it with a disquieting eagerness, his usual veneer of somber propriety utterly discarded. Silas watched, a silent sentinel to this private revelation, as Thorne leaned over the image, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles bleaching white. He did not weep. He did not sigh. Instead, a slow, deep breath escaped him, a sound of profound and unsettling satisfaction. His gaze was not one of mourning, but of consumption, tracing the lines of each face with a possessiveness that was almost carnal. He lingered on the children, on the mother, his expression one of a man examining a hard-won trophy, a collection finally completed. When his eyes found the blurred, tall figure in the background, he did not startle or express confusion as Silas had anticipated. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips, a mere ghost of an expression, but one that spoke of a dreadful recognition. This was not a surprise to him, it was a confirmation. He had not come to collect a memorial. He had come to claim a prize, the the tangible proof of his absolute and terrifying dominion over the family, a testament not to their lives, but to his power to orchestrate their end and then command their eternal, silent performance. His obsessive examination revealed a truth more damning than any confession. The photograph was not a record of their death, but the crowning achievement of his murder, and he was here to admire his own handiwork, the artist finally beholding his masterpiece of damnation. The final, framed photograph sat upon a high shelf in his studio, a dark eye that seemed to watch the room. Silas had covered it with a black cloth, a futile attempt to banish its oppressive presence, but he found his own gaze drawn to the shrouded shape at all hours. Late that night, working by the guttering light of a single candle to repair a camera's broken bellows, a flicker of movement from the shelf caught his attention. The cloth, he told himself, disturbed by a draft. Yet no window was open. The air was perfectly still and heavy. Compelled by a dread he could no longer suppress, he rose and approached the shelf, the candle held aloft in his trembling hand. The dancing flame cast long, leaping shadows across the walls. He reached out and slowly drew the black cloth away. The glass over the image caught the candlelight, for a moment reflecting only his own pale, haunted face. Then, as the flame dipped and surged, the scene within the frame seemed to stir. It was not a gross movement, not a hand raised or a head turned, but a subtle, horrifying shift in the play of light and shadow on the frozen faces. In the fleeting darkness as the flame wavered, the father's expression of paternal calm seemed to tighten into a rictus of suppressed horror. In the subsequent burst of light, the mother's gentle smile appeared to twist at the corners, becoming a grimace of silent anguish. The son's hopeful gaze, in the flicker, seemed to glaze over with a film of terror, and the daughter's innocent face, for a single, heart-stopping instant, was contorted into a mask of pure, childish fear. They were not at peace. They were trapped, their souls screaming from within the prison of the image, their agony revealed only in the unstable, pulsating light. The tall, blurred figure behind them seemed to grow more solid, its form coalescing in the rhythmic flashes, its presence the source of their torment, the warden of their photographic cell. The candle flame steadied, and the family returned to their serene poses, the moment of animation gone as if it had never been. But he had seen it. The photograph was not a static record. It was a living, breathing moment of their damnation, playing out in an endless, silent loop, their true suffering visible only to an observer standing in the same fragile, fleeting light that now threatened to extinguish itself in his hand. The realization did not dawn upon him slowly, but struck him with the force of a physical blow, sending him stumbling back from the flickering image to collapse into a chair, the truth settling over him like a shroud. He had been a fool to believe he was merely a hired artisan, a technician of light and shadow. Mr. Thorne's obsessive direction, his demand for specific poses and the family's own clothing, his unnatural satisfaction upon viewing the completed work, it was not the fastidiousness of a grieving relative, but the precision of a sorcerer conducting a ritual. The photograph was not a memento, it was a prison. The act of capturing their likenesses in that specific, lifelike arrangement, at the moment of their greatest betrayal and violent passing, using the very objects of their daily lives, had not simply preserved their memory. It had trapped their essence, their final, terrified consciousness, within the silver and glass. He, Silas, with his chemicals and his camera, had been the unwitting instrument of this damnation, the master builder of their eternal cage. His presence, his living breath and focused intention behind the lens, had provided the vital spark, the anchor that bound the spectral ritual to the physical world. He was not the artist. He was the final component, the lock on the door. The family's souls were not at rest, they were conscious and suffering, forced to reenact a pantomime of domestic bliss for all eternity, with the malevolent presence of their murderer standing watch over them forever. He had not just photographed the dead, he had helped to create a haunted object, a locus of torment so profound it defied comprehension. And in doing so, he had irrevocably tied his own life force to the artifact. He was a part of the mechanism now, his spirit woven into the spectral wires that held the Albrights in their endless performance. To destroy the photograph might shatter their souls entirely, or it might unleash their tormented spirits along with the thing that stood behind them. To keep it was to be a perpetual warden of his own nightmare, a living man shackled to the dead, forced to guard a hell of his own creation. The compulsion to look upon the photograph one last time was a morbid itch beneath his skin, a need to confirm the horror he now understood. He approached the ebony frame where it sat in the profound silence of his studio, the moon casting a thin, blue light through the skylight. For a long moment, the scene was as it had been composed, the family locked in their terrible pantomime of life, the tall, blurred watcher standing sentinel behind them. He traced the lines of their faces, seeing now not peace but the desperate strain of eternal captivity. It was then that he noticed a subtle wrongness in their collective gaze. Before, their eyes had been directed at one another, or slightly off into the middle distance, as he had posed them to simulate a shared moment. Now, their focus had shifted. The father was no longer looking thoughtfully at the globe, but slightly to his left. The mother's sightline had drifted from the sheet of music. The son and the daughter, too, had subtly altered the direction of their stares. A cold knot tightened in his stomach as he followed the converging lines of their vision. They were no longer looking at each other. They were all looking in the same direction, their attention focused on a single point just beyond the frame's edge. A drop of cold sweat traced a path down his spine. The logical, rational part of his mind screamed that it was impossible, a trick of his traumatized perception, but the evidence was there, etched in silver. Their eyes, once vacant, now held a unified, dreadful awareness. And as he stood there, paralyzed, the impossible occurred. In perfect, horrifying unison, their heads began to move. It was a slow, grinding pivot, a motion that defied the static nature of the captured image. The father turned from his globe, the mother from her pianoforte, the children from their play. Their faces, once arranged in expressions of bland tranquility, now held a knowing, accusatory stillness. They completed their turn, and every single pair of eyes, from the father's stern gaze to the daughter's wide, innocent one, was now fixed directly, unmistakably on him. They saw him standing there in the moonlit room. They saw the architect of their prison, the final witness to their torment. The spectral fifth figure remained a blur, but the family was now perfectly, terrifyingly aware of the world outside their frame, and the man who had put them there. The photograph was no longer a window into their past, it had become a door, and the occupants were now staring out, their silent condemnation a weight that would crush his soul.